Spearhead from Space. The unit guard in episode 2 is none other than producer Derek Sherwin himself. Originally cast as the unit attendant in this material was Jeff Brighty, but during filming he was found to be unsuitable for the part. The Silurians. Because the BBC did not have the equipment that designer Barry Newbury needed for construction, he instead hired outside contractors to perform the work. When Barry Newbury went to collect the finished sets, he was horrified to discover that the company had not built a framework on which to mount the walls, and, despite the firm's assurances, the sets were indeed too flimsy to stand erect. As a result, it was decided to abandon Doctor Who's usual production pattern, in which each week's studio session was devoted to one single episode. In recent years, improvements in editing technology had increasingly facilitated out-of-sequence recording, and now all of the cave scenes would be made together during the second studio date on December 15th. This would provide Barry Newbury with the time to assemble a new cave set, for which he principally used stock elements, together with some hastily constructed stalagmites and stalactites. So we can actually thank Barry Newbury for being ripped off that Doctor Who would eventually be recorded out of sequence, as opposed to being in order. The Ambassadors of Death. The broadcast of episode 3 on April 4th saw a small change to the schedule, with Doctor Who pushed back by 5 minutes to 5:20 p.m. to accommodate the broadcast of the Grand National. A bigger disruption occurred the following week, when Apollo 13 was scheduled to blast off from Cape Kennedy, Florida. As a result, the Debbie Reynolds show, which normally followed Doctor Who, was preempted, and the Ambassadors of Death episode 4 was instead scheduled to be followed by a repeat of Dad's Army, which usually aired after the American sitcom. However, April 11th was also the date of the FA Cup final between Chelsea and Leeds United. Because it went into extra time, and still ended up in a draw, the start of Doctor Who was delayed by half an hour. That was quite the busy week. Inferno. Normally, Doctor Who would have one studio day each week, which would be devoted to a single episode. However, producer Barry Letts thought it would be more efficient to record 2 episodes over 2 consecutive days on a fortnightly basis. This way, sets could be left up overnight, reducing the wear and tear which came from having them being taken down and set back up every week. As such, Inferno was made in 4 distinct recording sessions, rather than a whopping 7. Terror of the Autons. The Troll Dolls initially played a much greater role in the story's ending, justifying the Master's interest in the circus, which would have been used to distribute the toys. Script editor Terence Dix disliked writer Robert Holmes' idea that the plastic daffodils, and at one point the Troll Dolls, would be animated when the temperature reached a certain level, with the Master anticipating a heat wave in Britain. Terence Dix felt that this made the story setting illogical. Wouldn't it make much more sense for the Master to carry out his plan in a tropical location? And so the temperature trigger was replaced with a broadcast activation signal. The attempted arrival on Earth of a Nestine energy form was added to episode 4 at this point. The Mind of Evil. An unusual complication occurred when costume designer Bobby Bartlett outsourced the assembly of the Stangmore prison convict uniforms to a freelancer who had recently left the well-regarded Bermans and Nathans. The individual was then arrested for theft from his former employers without completing his Doctor Who work. Designer Bobby Bartlett was forced to visit him in prison in order to discover the location of his materials, which were then given to another costumer to finish the job. Ironic how this episode deals with prison life, and one of the staff members ended up in prison. The Claws of Axos. Frustratingly, the weather proved highly variable throughout the 5-day shoot, ranging from snow at the start of the week, through thick fog, and finally to sunshine on the last day. Director Michael Ferguson asked script editor Terence Dix for dialogue to explain this inconsistency. As such, Corporal Bell would now note that the arrival of Axos had prompted freak weather conditions. Unhappy with the situation, producer Barry Letts became determined to avoid lengthy mid-winter location shoots in the future. Colony in Space. When Barry Letts and Terence Dix intentionally pitched Doctor Who to a slightly older audience than in the past, the BBC decided to overhaul the Saturday evening schedule, beginning with the transmission of Colony in Space episode 1 on April 10th. Doctor Who would now air at 6:10 in the evening, almost an hour late than before. It was preceded by Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Colour, which occupied its former time slot, and a news update, and led into a Tom and Jerry cartoon short, and then a series of movies branded as the Saturday Western. The new schedule paid dividends almost immediately, boosting Doctor Who's audience by more than 1 million viewers each week. The Demons. Amusingly, the climax of episode 5 shocked some viewers, who wrote letters condemning the BBC for blowing up a real church, when in fact it was just a model, filmed on location.
You maniacs! You blew it up! Damn you! Damn you all to hell!
It's only a model.
Day of the Daleks. Having viewed some of the earlier Dalek serials, director Paul Bernard had concluded that he disliked the effect of producing the Dalek voice using a ring modulator. Consequently, no electronic enhancement would be utilised for their dialogue in Day of the Daleks, resulting in a very different Dalek voice. Paul Bernard was ultimately displeased with the element of the serial, and felt that voice artists Oliver Gilbert and Peter Mezzolene had not been good choices to play the Daleks. The Curse of Peladon. As scripted, episode 3 featured the Doctor soothing Agador by intoning the Tibetan chant Om Mani Padme Hum. Instead, it was decided to use an extended version of the Venusian nursery rhyme Koklida Patha Menin Klach, introduced in 1971's The Demons. Pertwee sang the nonsense words to the tune of the Christmas carol God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it. The Sea Devils. On March 13th, the Doctor Who office was visited by 2 officials from the Ministry of Defence. They were concerned that episode 3, that had aired 2 days earlier, had included footage which featured the design for a top-secret prototype submarine. It transpired that the submarine was actually a model, which visual effects designer Peter Day had adapted from a kit bought at Woolworths. With input from director Michael Bryant, Peter Day had incorporated features which were intended to make the prop look more advanced, such as streamlined propellers. In doing so, he inadvertently attained a close approximation of the Polaris submarine design actually being tested by naval intelligence. The Mutants. Script editor Terence Dix decided to change the slang term for the Solonians from munt to mutt. The former was intended to be a contraction of the phrase mutant native, and was a genuine derogatory term used by white settlers of South Africa to refer to the indigenous black population. Also, head of serials Ronnie Marsh feared that it was too easily mistaken for a more familiar vulgarity. I'll let you guys figure out what vulgarity it was. The Time Monster. At Strathfield's say, stuntman Greg Powell, playing the knight to attack the convoy in episode 3, was thrown from his horse when his mount did not follow the planned route and collided with one of the unit vehicles. Accounts vary as to the extent of the injuries to both Powell and the horse. Equity, the Actors' Union, condemned the incident because budgetary limitations had prevented director Paul Bernard from hiring more than one single stunt driver. The Three Doctors. On February 3rd, Bob Baker and Dave Martin submitted an idea called Death World, in which the Time Lords were in conflict with a Federation of Evil led by a personification of death. To avert all-out war, the Time Lords convinced the Federation to allow them to send the Three Doctors into the Federation's limbo-like underworld domain. There, the Doctors battled various representations of death, including zombies, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, the Hindu goddess Kali, and the Cyclops Polyphemus from Greek mythology, with the victor in the contests determining whether the Time Lords or the Federation of Evil would prevail. This story was later adapted into the Lost Stories range for Big Finish, and as of recording this video, I haven't listened to it yet. Carnival of Monsters. On June 1st and 2nd, cast and crew boarded the RFA Robert Dundas at Chatham, Kent. The vessel, which had been launched in 1938 and finally decommissioned in December 1971, posed as the SS Bernice. The Robert Dundas spent part of the first day travelling along the River Medway to Sheerness, Kent, but was otherwise docked during production. At one point, the shoot was interrupted when it was discovered that an old brass ship's compass had disappeared. The culprit turned out to be none other than John Pertwee, who had mistakenly believed that the compass was to be scrapped along with the Robert Dundas, and therefore wouldn't be missed. In fact, it was to be auctioned off along with other ship artefacts, and after learning his mistake, an embarrassed John Pertwee duly returned it. Frontier in Space. During production on Frontier in Space, Roger Delgado informed producer Barry Letts that he wanted to wind up his appearances as the Master. Many producers still believed that he was working full-time on Doctor Who, as had been the case during Season 8, and were not considering him for other work, even though Roger Delgado was now featuring in just 1 or 2 Doctor Who stories per season. It was agreed that Delgado would therefore appear in a single adventure during season 11, in which the Master would sacrifice his life to save the Doctor. As such, Barry Letts and writer Robert Sloman began developing the final game in early 1973. Sadly, this serial would never be made. On June the 18th, Roger Delgado died in a traffic mishap while being driven to a filming location in Turkey. Frontier in Space would therefore mark the premature end of the beloved actor's involvement in Doctor Who. Planet of the Daleks. The only venue required was Beachfields Quarry in Redhill, Surrey, which had just been used as the surface of the Ogron planet in Frontier in Space. This time it was the site of the ice pool on Spyridon, with recording taking place on January 2nd and 3rd, 1973. Looks like the Doctor and the Daleks didn't have much of a journey from the Ogron planet to Spyridon. The Green Death. In episode 3, the Brigadier rings the Ministry and the Prime Minister is referred to as Jeremy. The reference to the Prime Minister as Jeremy came at Barry Letts' instigation, partly to avoid offending the current Prime Minister, Edward Heath, and partly because the producer hoped that Jeremy Thorpe, the leader of the Liberal Party, would win the next UK general election. It would take another 37 years, but the Lib Dems got in power eventually. The Time Warrior. The role of Sarah Jane Smith originally went to April Walker, an actress who had previously appeared in episodes of The Aeneid Line, Dad's Army, and Crossroads. She was contracted for Doctor Who's 11th season on March 14th. When John Pertwee was presented with this news, he was very unhappy that he had been offered no input into the casting process. He had worked with Walker before in the West End on Oh Clarence in 1968, and found that he had little chemistry with the actress. April Walker also did not have the petite, slender body type that John Pertwee felt worked best opposite his Doctor. As such, April Walker's contract was cancelled on March 29th, though she would be paid in full for the season. Invasion of the Dinosaurs. To preserve the surprise of the monster's nature, producer Barry Letts agreed to director Paddy Russell's suggestion that episode 1 be promoted and broadcast as simply Invasion. Writer Malcolm Hulke was irate at the use of such a generic title, which he feared would damage the serial's ratings. On January 14, 1974, 2 days after episode 1 aired, Malcolm Hulke formally protested a decision he viewed as potentially damaging to his reputation as a writer. Producer Barry Letts subsequently admitted that the gimmick had not only been misguided, but had been undermined by the advanced publicity which unambiguously advertised the dinosaur's appearance. Both Barry Letts and head of serials Ronnie Marsh extended apologies to Malcolm Hulke, though this would turn out to be the writer's last script for Doctor Who. Death to the Daleks. In editing, it was realised that episode 3 was running short, while episode 4 was very long. As a result, material from the start of the concluding instalment was used to form a new cliffhanger. Originally, episode 3 ended when the Daleks emerged into the maze room. It now continued to the Doctor and Belial reaching the trapped floor pattern, and ended on the Doctor's warning to not move, resulting in one of the most infamous cliffhangers of the series. The Monster of Peladon. This serial consequently underwent numerous alterations. For instance, the Ice Warriors were originally defeated when the Doctor managed to transmit word of their treachery to the Federation, who blockaded and threatened to destroy the Ice Warrior planet. A casualty of these rewrites was a 1-week delay of the serial's pre-filming at BBC Television Film Studios in Ealing, London. This change of schedule meant that fewer facilities would be available to the Monster of Peladon at Ealing, and one day would have to be shelved from the schedule. Planet of the Spiders. As well as being John Pertwee's last story, this is the only story from the classic series where the co-writer, the director, and the producer were all the same man, Barry Letts. And that's the John Pertwee era all done. Let me know in the comments below what your favourite facts are, and I'll see you next time for some more Doctor Who trivia. Goodbye.